So a few months back, I made a video on the worst once per duel effects, so I thought it was about time I made a video on the best cards which have a once per duel restriction. And at number 10, we have the Twinheaded Behemoth, one of the earliest once per duel effect cards in the game. And being one of the earliest of these kinds of effects, the way this card was worded when it originally came out was done in a way that each individual copy of Twinheaded Behemoth had their own once per duel effects tied to them. So it was basically like 3 times per duel. And because of this rulings nightmare, because it wasn't supposed to work like that, this card actually got limited to 1 copy, so that people wouldn't get confused anymore about how to actually use its effect, since you could only use 1 copy. So basically, what this card does is if it's destroyed, you can special summon it during your next standby phase, and then you set its attack and defense to 1000 exactly. And this effect was actually pretty good back in the day, when having monsters survive to your next turn so that you can then tribute them was still a big deal. And the fact that this was a high attack, level 3 dragon type monster actually gave it a little bit of a boost, as all of those things really did matter in those days. It's no longer played anymore though. Its effect is kind of underpowered for how strong cards are nowadays, and they also did eventually errata its effect so that it's no longer confusing. So there was no need for it to be limited to 1 copy anymore. And I think this might be the only card in the history of the game which was put on the banned list because they didn't write how its effect worked well enough. And at number 9, we have Bacon Saver. This card has a graveyard effect where you can banish it in order to negate 1 attack, but you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, this card saw a lot of play in Duel Links and still occasionally sees plays in decks that specifically mill cards from the deck to the graveyard, as negating 1 attack from the graveyard is actually a big deal in Duel Links, but it never saw any play in the TCG, especially since this card came out after Necro Gardena, which is a card that is straight up better than Bacon Saver and has the exact same effect, without a once per duel clause to it. And if anything, every time I see Konami release a weaker version of a card that exists, I automatically assume it's because they want to add it to Duel Links someday. And it kind of makes sense when you see stuff like Bacon Saver with a nerfed effect of an existing card actually see play because it was put into a different meta. And at number 8, we have the Seal of Orichalcos. Now, this is the only field spell card that can only be activated once per duel. So, if this card is destroyed or removed from the field, you can't play another copy later on in the duel, which is why most people who play this card only ever play 1 copy in their deck. So what this card does is all monsters you control will gain 500 attack, and that's the highest attack point gain from a field spell card that works on any monster without any restrictions, which kind of makes sense since it does have a once per duel activation clause. If you control 2 or more face-up attack position monsters, your opponent cannot target your monsters with the lowest attack for an attack, so it offers some battle protection for your face-up monsters. And also, once per turn, this card cannot be destroyed by card effects, which is pretty good protection honestly. Your opponent has to destroy this card 2 times in the same turn in order to get rid of it, and having 1 charge of protection per turn actually allows this card to stay in the field pretty well, and discourages your opponent from even trying to destroy it in most cases. So all these effects are pretty good on a field spell card, but it does have 2 downsides to it, or I guess I should say 2 additional downsides, plus the once per duel clause, as when you activate this card, it destroys all of your special summon monsters. And while this card is on the field, you can't special summon monsters from your extra deck. Honestly, I think the whole not being able to special summon from your extra deck restriction would have been more than enough to balance this card out, but they also gave it a once per duel clause on top of it. And at number 7, we have the Electromagnetic Turtle. This card has a very similar effect to Bacon Saver, where you can banish it from the graveyard in order to end the battle phase. And when I say similar, I mean a much better effect than Bacon Saver, as it's able to stop an entire battle phase instead of just 1 attack. So it's perfectly reasonable for this card to have a once per duel clause to it, and this is kind of a good example of why the once per duel clause exists, because they usually just slap it on top of monsters that have really good effects, and being able to stop the battle phase with a card from your graveyard is a pretty good effect, which is why this card occasionally sees niche play in meta decks. Not very often, but it does show up from time to time, especially in stall decks. And at number 6, we have Dotscaper. This is a level 1 Cybers type monster, which has an effect where if this card is sent to the graveyard, or banished, you can special summon this card. And you can only special summon this card from the graveyard or the banish zone once per duel. So basically it has 2 once per duel effects, depending on where this card is special summoned from, which is pretty rare, as most cards only have 1 once per duel clause on one of their effects, or on the entire card itself. And this card absolutely has an effect that's worth a once per duel restriction, as being able to special summon the card if it's just sent to the graveyard or just banished, as this can be done in any way, including with a Foolish Burial directly from the deck, or a Gold Sarcophagus, banishing this card directly from the deck. This card is pretty good with Link plays, especially its Cybers type, as Link monsters love the Cybers tag, as I think about half of all Link monsters are Cybers type. And some of them specifically require Cybers monsters in order to do things, or to have a shared type of monster in order to bring out other cards. So since Dotscaper shares the Cybers tag with Link monsters, it can combo very well with them for more Link monsters. Especially since cards that can special summon themselves from the graveyard are generally some of the most powerful cards in the game. And at number 5, we have Spore. If this card is in your graveyard, you can banish another plant-type monster from your graveyard in order to special summon this card from your graveyard. And then this card will gain levels equal to the level of the banished card. And you can only special summon this card from the graveyard with its effect once per duel. Now, this card was really good back in the Synchro days, and many people considered it overpowered, because it was a tuner monster that could easily special summon itself from the graveyard and basically become whatever level you wanted, back when that used to be a much bigger deal. Nowadays, it's just a tuner monster that can special summon itself from the graveyard, which is also still pretty good, and is why this card was put on the forbidden list for a hot second. This card was actually taken off the forbidden list pretty quickly, and is one of 3 cards that has a distinction of being banned for only one format, before coming off the forbidden list, with the other 2 cards being Injection Fairy Lily and United We Stand. Mainly because this card already had a once per duel clause to it, so there wasn't too many ways to abuse it. And at number 4, we have Blackwing, Steam of the Cloak. This card has an effect where if it leaves the field, you get to special summon a Steam token, which is a level 1 token with 100 attack and defense and no restrictions on it. And the interesting thing about this effect is that it's not once per turn. So if you're able to bring out this card multiple times and remove it from the field, you can special summon as many tokens as you want, and use them for Link plays. And it also has a graveyard effect, where you can tribute 1 monster on the field in order to special summon this card from the graveyard. And you can only use this effect once per duel. And it also has an extra effect, or I guess I should say an extra restriction, that when it's brought out from the graveyard, since this card is a tuner monster, you can only use it for the synchro material of a Blackwing synchro monster. Which is not really why people use this card in the current meta. Because you see, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you get to bring out a token, which is very useful. And you can also tribute that token to bring this card back from the graveyard if you need an effect monster on the field for Link materials, or a level 3 synchro monster for other things, like using a Needle Fiber if it's ever brought to the TCG. But outside of its usefulness with a card that doesn't exist in the TCG, this one card is just a lot of advantage. It has a good once per duel effect, but its really good effect is the token generating one. And I'm not sure if it would see much play if it wasn't for the fact that it had the token generating effect on top of its once per duel effect. And at number 3, we have another Blackwing monster, this time Blackwing Zephyros the Elite. If this card is in your graveyard, you can return 1 face-up card you control to your hand in order to special summon this card. And then you take 400 points of damage. And you can only use this special summon once per duel. Now, this card is really good because its cost in order to bring itself out from the graveyard is actually a plus for a lot of decks, who use that effect to recycle cards on the field in order to use their effects again. And also, special summoning a monster from the graveyard is just really good, especially when the card can do it itself. Cards which can special summon themselves from the graveyard, like I said with Dotscaper and Spore, are just so valuable that they usually have a once per duel effect on them, as you'll see one more time as we go to a later spot on this list. And with the current meta having a lot of dark archetypes, which lock their decks into only using dark monsters, Blackwing Zephyros the Elite has been seeing a lot more play as of recent, and has been seen play pretty much since it first came out, and is probably one of the most used Blackwing cards ever released, because on top of its good effect, it has decent stats for a level 4 monster. And even its little 400 points of damage you take can be used in beneficial ways, like proccing Heroic Challenger Thousand Blades effect. And at number 2, we have Predaplant Darlingtonia Cobra. This card has the effect where if it's special summoned by the effect of a Predaplant monster, you get to add one polymerization spell card or a spell card with fusion in its name from your deck to your hand. And you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, since this card requires it to be special summoned by a Predaplant monster, you'd think that would make this card kind of hard to use, except that Predaplants have this card called Predaplant Orpheus Scorpio, which, when it's normal or special summoned, you can send a monster from your hand to the graveyard in order to special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. And since this card can pull Cobra directly from your deck, that actually makes its +1 effect very easy to accomplish, and very good, as 2 cards it can pull out, Brilliant Fusion and Instant Fusion, both see a lot of play, and are both very good in a wide variety of decks, to the point where Brilliant Fusion is currently limited to 1 copy. So with a single Predaplant Orpheus Scorpio in your hand, you get to search out a Cobra and go +1 off of Cobra's search. And if the card you searched out was Brilliant Fusion, that card itself can also allow you to go +1 as well, if you use it to bring out Gem Knight Seraphinite and send a light monster to the graveyard that can special summon itself, which will give you 4 monsters on the field and an additional normal summon, all from 1 summon. Which is why Cobra is a very heavily played once per duel monster, and also why they put Brilliant Fusion on the ban list, because even if you use it to search out an instant fusion, that's still a really good effect as well. And at number 1, we have Glowup Bulb. This level 1 tuner monster has the effect where you can send the top card of your deck to the graveyard in order to special summon this card from the graveyard, and you can only use this effect once per duel. Now, the great thing about this effect is that the cost of sending a card from the top of your deck to the graveyard is actually a plus to a lot of decks who want cards in the graveyard, which is basically every single meta deck. And also, special summoning a tuner from the graveyard under its own power is good in just about any deck, especially since it can just be used for link materials, even if you don't use it for synchros or any other cards that need to use a tuner monster with it. And in the OCG, where they have a link monster called Kriston Needlefiber, Glowup Bulb is banned, because that link monster allows Glowup Bulb to combo with it too well, in order to become a 1-card link 3 or 4 monster. But since the TCG does not have Needlefiber, Glowup Bulb is currently unlimited, and can be used in any deck, but isn't really used very much, because a lot of top decks run an engine that requires Dark-type monsters. But that doesn't mean this card's effect is not really good, and people are always looking for ways to break this card again, because its effect is just too good. And that's why this card was put on the forbidden list and banned after it came out pretty quickly, because it was way too good in the synchro era, and then came off the ban list for a few years, and can very easily go back on the ban list if a certain link monster ever gets introduced to the TCG. I doubt too many people would argue with Glowup Bulb being the number 1 spot on this list, because it's usually the card thought of when people think of good once per duel effects, as it was one of the earliest and is still one of the strongest. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other better once per duel effects that should have made this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for weekly videos just like this one.